Hello, and welcome to Old Ways in New Jersey. I'm Angus Cress Gillespie, your host. And today we're going to try to attempt something a little bit different. We're going to go back much further in time, thousands of years back, and much farther in space to distant lands in Africa. We're most fortunate here in East Brunswick to have a resident who's an expert in primatology. Of course, primatology is the scientific study of primates, and this field includes the study of a special group of mammals, specifically monkeys and apes and humans. Dr. Esteban Sarmiento is both an East Brunswick resident and a primatologist. Esteban has worked with the Museum of Natural History in New York. He's conducted field work in the jungles of Africa. Now, any discussion of primatology inevitably leads to a study of evolution. I'm pleased that we have an expert on all this right here in East Brunswick. Here to help us sort it all out is Dr. Esteban Sarmiento. Dr. Sarmiento, let's start with the basics. What is a primate?
It's an order of mammals. Mammals are the animals that breastfeed their young, and they bear young alive. We divide mammals into a number of orders, and one of them is primates, and some orders are very specific. So if I go to the group that holds the whales, they'll all live in the sea.
Yeah.
But with something like primates, it's sort of a generalized group. So, bats is another order.
Yeah.
That's very specific to flying mammals. But primates are sort of generalized. And basically that's, in a way, what sets them out as a group. They're a very generalized group of mammals.
And when did you first realize that you were interested in primates?
Well, I think before I really went, probably before I was in high school, but it wasn't really till I got to college that I realized that I could actually study them, because I think you don't see that as a possibility until you see other people that actually have jobs doing that.
And as a follow-up, where did you go to college?
I went, as an undergraduate, I went to Rutgers.
Ah, and for graduate school?
I went to New York University.
So are you more interested in the living primates or the fossil primates?
It's like, if you're interested in fossils, you can work on stuff that goes back, hundreds of millions of years. I don't do that. So being that I work on primates that are mammals, I'll work on fossils that are mammals, and they go back 70 million years. Actually, they go back further, but the ones that we can recognize now go about 70 million years, the orders that we can recognize. And because I work with humans and their closest relatives, I only go back 5 or 10 million years. And so I do work on fossils, but they're very much like the living animals I study. They're not going back to animals that don't presently exist, or types of animals that don't presently exist, families that don't presently exist.
Based on my reading your book, is it fair to call yourself a fossil hunter, or is that a derogatory?
I mean, you can say I don't really mind if you say I'm a fossil hunter, but that's to tell the truth. Like, being a fossil hunter would be sort of boring.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's better to say a fossil researcher, because the hunting is serving a purpose.
Yeah, even researcher is sort of boring, because I don't just work with fossils. In fact, I don't think that fossils, out of the people that do work on fossils, I'm one of the few that really don't think fossils have the answers. It's the living animals that have the answers, and with what we learn from the living animals, we can extrapolate and learn about the fossils.
And tell me a little bit, where have you done your field work?
I mean, in so many places. I guess probably the best way to start is probably in Africa. I worked in South Africa at a lot of the fossil sites. I was very interested in seeing if these fossils that people called human ancestors, to see in the areas they lived and what it is that they lived like, because I didn't really, and still don't, believe that all of them are human ancestors. So I first went out there, and I knew that really a lot of the questions were going to come from studying the living ones. But still, I wanted to know a little bit about the fossils, so I went to South Africa. But before that, I had studied orangutans.
It's important to go back and forth between the fossil and the living.
Yeah. And I had studied orangutans, and they were living, and I did some work in Southeast Asia, and also work in animals in the zoo.
When I was in college, I had a course in physical anthropology. It's a long time ago.
What school was it?
Yale.
And who taught you there?
Sidney Mintz. He was really more of a cultural guy.
But there was John Butner-Janusz was at Yale.
And I remember the Olduvai Gorge and Leakey, and it was all very exciting at the time.
At the time, and in part, what the press comes at is with fossils that you read, popularly. Is I guess a romantic vision of what, and it sort of has what the people want to hear more than it has, reality behind it.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of archaeological fossil digging is tiresome, tedious, time-consuming. You don't just suddenly have a great discovery every 5 minutes.
Yeah, archaeology is a study of human artifacts, or old, and the fossil work, I guess, is called paleo anthropology. Right. So that you're actually digging. So the two are sometimes dug at the same times, but a lot of the early fossils that people are thinking are human ancestors, or believe they do, and this is from periods from 3.5 to 2 million years, aren't associated with tools. So there is no archaeological work to do there, just straight bone collecting.
And why are skulls so important?
No specific part of the animal is important. However, when I eat an animal, I rarely eat its teeth. I've never ever found teeth to be very digestible. As a result, most fossils that you find are teeth. That means once in a while a crocodile will swallow a whole animal, he'll pass it through his gut, but the teeth will still come out. And that's what you'll find. They're very hard. Enamel is the hardest surface in our body, right? Dentin is close behind, and that's what we find. And so as a result of finding a lot, we've put a lot of importance on it. Moreover, when it comes to skulls, the base of skulls have a number of anatomical elements, like arteries,
the foramen.
Arteries, veins, nerves that come together in very complex interrelationships, and as a result, they tend to give us clues as to what the animal is, much more than other parts. If I just have a long bone and just a shaft, well, it could belong to a chicken, a crocodile, or maybe a mammal, but it becomes more difficult. I'd have to look at it microscopically, see how the bone is laid to know it's the shaft of a reptile, or it's the shaft of a mammal. I need more. But a little piece of a skull can sometimes be very, very detailed and tell me very specifically what the animal is. I mean, I don't know, you must know that we have, as mammals, we have more mobility in our neck, so we're able to move our head this way and also this way. And so we have special vertebra I guess,
that allow that.
That allow that, and also in the articulations in the base of the skull that are specifically mammalian. We also have an ear, a middle ear, with these 3 ossicles, and we've learned them as the hammer, the
anvil, stirrup,
and the stirrup, right? And they have they have scientific names, but it doesn't matter. Those are specific to mammals. So when we find a little piece of the ear, we can say it's a mammal. And also they change from mammal to mammal, so sometimes they can actually allow us to place into one of the orders of living mammals.
That's really cool. From that little tiny set of bones, you can extract a lot of information.
A lot of information as to the relationship of the animal.
Now,
so did that answer your question? Or was I too specific?
No, it was good. I like that. In your book, you argue that there's several different kinds of pre-existing humans, some of which worked out evolutionary and some didn't. It's kind of a complicated subject, but can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I think I can. Not everything that is born anytime is going to have offspring. Okay, and this can be extrapolated farther to many generations. That means lineages. And you can just think of, maybe grandparents of fathers and sons in your family, some that had
progeny,
and others that didn't, right? And it's the same thing with species. Sometimes species get to a certain point. It's a lineage, right? That they stop having progeny and they become extinct. And other times they keep going. So when we look at anything in life, when we look at any lineage in life, we're always seeing the lineages diverge. Yeah. But at one point, they die out. And some of them can die earlier, and some of them can die later.
It's almost as if to say it's not preordained that we humans ended up looking the way we do. We could have ended up looking a little bit different.
We could have looked different, or each of us as an individual. Yeah. Not. I mean, those things get down to who we are and what we are, and who are we really? That we exist. Yeah. But yeah, that's true.
Some more elementary things. Tell us a little bit about the importance of upright walking.
As modern humans, upright walking has molded most of the parts in our body. And in fact, if you look at someone that has had polio and muscle atrophy, and if you look at their skeleton, you will see overall differences throughout their body. People that are quadriplegic and wheelchair bound, you will see differences throughout their body that have to do with not maintaining an erect posture.
It's almost like use it or lose it.
In part, it is use it. There's certain mechanisms that, for our own good, shut off if we don't do something. And we know this is a problem in the space program when we send people to these space stations for 8 or 9 weeks, where they have an inordinate amount of bone loss. And the reason that you have it is because you're not stressing the bone. If the bone isn't stressed, then it isn't posited and redeposited.
That's very interesting.
So this is one thing about walking erect. It's important to us. And I know, some people don't like to walk. We have a car, and we get in the car, and we drive but it's really, especially as you get older, you think, I'm going to go to the gym and lift weights and all that stuff. But the truth is, you'd probably be better served by walking 3 miles than doing things that maybe stress you more than, or don't stress what's really, you've been evolutionarily set up for.
How are we similar to Cro-Magnons?
We are Cro-Magnons, you know that. Oh. You know that, right? Was that a trick question?
Yeah, it's a trick question.
Cro-Magnons is an early skeletons, I guess, the best thing, from France that were found, and they look like modern humans. And they were, of course, by that time they're only maybe 50,000 years old. I forgot, they have some new dates now for this stuff. But these skeletons, because they were very old at the time and believed to be very old, and they were associated with specific type of tools, became sort of widely known in the popular press as the earliest humans, as the earliest modern humans, and we call them Cro-Magnons.
Is there any comparable thing in North America or in New Jersey?
No. Actually, I was at the meetings this week, and they had a number of people from South America, and they're all South American, and there is this problem of the early sites in South America. We all know that most of the sites that we find skeletons in aren't more than 12,000 years old. But there's these few sites that, and again, they're controversial, that people believe to go back to 40,000, 30,000. And of course, those people that are familiar with it and worked on it, they would say, well, of course they do. And those that haven't would doubt it. Now, I don't specifically work with those sites.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, have I visited any of them? I don't think I visited any of them. The earliest one in North America is Kennewick Man. And again, it's believed to be more than 12,000 years old. I don't exactly know what the age is.
That Kennewick Man, where was it found?
Washington State.
Okay.
It could even be, I'm pretty sure,
Okay.
But it's in the Northwest someplace, believe me. All right, and there's other stuff found in Texas. There was one thing that was, believed to be, or I guess the press popularly called it about 40,000 years old. But, when things were investigated, these things usually turn out to be 12,000. Now, these older, what they did find out is that when you get back to these fossils that they believe are older in their morphology and what they look like, they're very much different than the Indian populations that exist in the Americas today. So there's been
speculation.
Well, there's been a lot of arguments that some of these populations may come from other areas besides Asia, maybe even Micronesia on one side, or maybe even Northern Africa on the other side. And it's very much in its infancy, but in general, we don't believe there's good evidence for humans being in North and South America much before 12, 14,000 years. There's so many stories. I mean, you must remember the Kon-Tiki, right?
Oh yeah, sure. Thor Heyerdahl.
And Thor Heyerdahl wanted to see if Micronesian populations could have populated the Easter Islands and vice versa.
So you built that balsa raft?
And they built the balsa raft, and they said, could they make it on a regular? Could you actually make it without any modern technology? And he obviously did make it. Did it prove that it? That's different. Did it prove anything? Well, I don't know. It proved that it could have rafted, but did it raft? I don't know. But there is a lot of similarities between Japanese culture and some of the Ecuadorian cultures. I mean, there's a whole pottery. There's a whole pottery culture in Ecuador that's very Japanese-like, and so there's a lot of ties that people see. But these still need further elaboration before they're believable.
It's a funny thing about Thor Heyerdahl, because he can be dismissed as an adventurer rather than as a scientist. But I say, well, God bless him, because he gets people excited about science.
I'm sure he got a good tan.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're on a ship like that, you get a pretty good tan. No vitamin D deficiency.
In your own work, are you more interested in anatomy or behavior?
Actually, I believe behavior is the controlled movement of body segments in three-dimensional space. So I don't really believe in the metaphysical, although I guess that would be nice. So all my behavior is associated with movement of segments. So the two are interrelated. You can't show a behavior if you don't have the segments for it.
Okay. I'll take that, even though it's a little evasive.
Is it a little bit evasive? No, the two are related. I mean, it's sort of like saying you can't stop your car without brakes. Brakes are part of the anatomy of your car.
Okay.
And if you want more specific, if you have drum brakes, they're a little different than disc brakes. So I can say if you can't stop a car that weighs so much, it's quick unless you have disc brakes. So we can say the same thing about behaviors. You cannot do those behaviors if you don't have this, and that anatomy.
Okay. In your work, what's better, a field study or laboratory study?
I think field and laboratory both have their place.
Okay.
Like, I know personally, I need a lot of money for laboratory studies.
Yeah.
And on the other hand,
you get a grant.
Yeah. On the other hand, evolution is in itself is like a big experiment. So the way natural history type of research goes is that you take what's now on Earth as some experiment in that each different species or population of animal is undergoing, and you use those to play against each other. And there's something called the comparative method. It was used by Darwin in his studies on natural selection. It was used by Karl Marx in his study on this Kapital. So it works for almost everything. And you can use that to extract facts, and without really doing, because the experiments have already been done for you, whether it's a society and looking why it is that the society got to this level of organization, as Karl Marx did, or whether it's an animal to see how it got to this level, as Darwin did.
A follow-up to that, can you, as a scientist, can you study primate behavior in a captive setting?
You can, and people thought it was, at one time people thought it was more probably specific because you could have better control, but at the same time you really don't. I think nowadays people realize that when you can control some variables, you're really not in control of all these other variables, and there's so many variables at work that it can be kind of confounding. I mean, we as humans like to control everything around us, but the truth is, it's very difficult. You must know, if we've had children, or if you have, it's very hard to control the child's behavior.
Yeah.
And you can pretty much say, okay, I'm going to control it doing A and B, but that hardly ever works out. So then when you have captive animals, you don't really realize that captivity itself is setting them up to be as something that isn't natural.
Yeah.
So that a lot of your stuff then suffers with other variables that you've introduced as a result of a captive situation.
Some of your assumptions might be wrong.
And some of your assumptions can be wrong, or all of them. Some is being kind.
Again, as a layman, I'm sort of vaguely aware of the work of Jane Goodall. How would you evaluate her work?
You know, Jane Goodall is what I call popular.
Okay.
And as a result of her popularity, you know, she's an economic engine. And, you know, she really isn't, but the people around her are.
Yeah.
As a result of that, we've got a lot of, you know, Jane Goodall was the first to show that, you know, chimpanzees use tools. But that's not really true. Jane Goodall was, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But all these things are sort of been rained on her so that this economic engine can keep going. Now, if you look at...
So she dramatized the work.
Well, she didn't. She didn't. She just went and did her work. But, you know, so it turned out that economic forces were with her.
Yeah.
They saw the value in it.
Yeah.
And then they're the ones that dramatized it. I don't think she dramatized, you know, she's pretty, if you know her, she's a very self-effacing person. Yeah. And, you know, now she's in her older years in life, and she's actually, you know, very nurturing, you'd almost say. But that doesn't necessarily mean what you are or what you want doesn't necessarily mean it's the end result.
Yeah.
One thing I can say is that Africa's changed much since she started her studies in the 60s, and the area where she worked was, I'm not going to say it was pristine, but relative to what it is today is. And you know, the chimpanzees now that she's studied are pretty well isolated. They've undergone a number of epidemics because of the density in human populations around them, and they're almost living in a captive situation. Even though they're not really captive, but they're almost living in a captive where you have to be after them if an epidemic pops up, either, you know, a flu, or they've actually undergone polio. Well, and if you know, polio is a waterborne disease. So when people, you know, defecate in the water and others drink it, they contract polio. And so chimpanzees can get polio from humans, and humans from vice versa.
You've told me before in your work, you've worked with forest rangers in some of these African countries in order to preserve the habitat?
Yeah, one of the things that's where the money is in, you know, these large U.S. corporations, because they have contracts for resources in some of these third world countries, will give a number of funds for preservation of habitat or conservation. In a lot of these areas, they've been worn, torn. No one really knows what's in there. And, you know, with a war, a whole village could be, or many villages can be well armed, and they can decimate the animals. So sometimes somebody has to go in there and see what's there. Is it worth even saving this? Because you have to move these people out. And so sometimes that has to be done. Sometimes these areas are very small, and very rare animals remain there. And then you have to try to get them protected. So you do have to work with rangers, you know, basically soldiers in some of these areas.
And you must feel good about that kind of work.
I think it's necessary.
Yeah.
It's sort of one of, there's lots of things you feel good or bad, but there's things that you feel are necessary that you sort of have to do. You're obliged to do them.
Let me give you a question from left field. The comment, if you will, briefly on the relationship between primatology and sociobiology.
Whoa. I don't really know how to answer that except sociobiology is like an undercurrent in some primatological studies. And what we mean
there.
we understand what sociobiology, would you tell me what sociobiology is so we know we both understand the same thing?
Isn't it the biological basis of sociological interaction?
Well, yeah, or studying social behavior and other things besides humans.
Well, for grooming, for example.
Right, what their function has, in societies other than humans, because ants do a bunch of, and again, using comparative methods to extract what the value of this social behavior is.
Can orangutans be taught language?
One thing, before I talk about language or say anything, if language is what we use,
yes.
I like to think of, there are other forms of communications, and do we call them language? So does a chimpanzee, what they use to communicate when it's vocal, is it called language? I mean, it can be. I don't know. I really, language has such a fuzzy definition.
Yeah.
That if you're saying, can they learn to use a language or in the similar to ours? Ours is pretty complicated, but can they show some of the same foundations we have for language? Yes, because they're closely related to us and they have pretty much the same tools we have. Not exactly the same ones, but very close to those that we have.
Let me wade into another controversial area. Among primates, do you find like males naturally tend towards dominance?
Well, there's different species of primates, and they all have different behaviors.
Okay.
Now, in general, in areas where it's very seasonal, the habitat, that means it can change very quickly from, year to year. It can be very nasty as far as leaving an animal with nothing to eat for a long time. In those areas, it pays for males to be very dominant and have females as a harem. And it's very easily explained. Females carry the population. So in times when everything falls apart and there's no food, if it doesn't pay to carry hundreds of males in a population, because they're just going to eat your food and they're not going to give you anything in return. It pays to carry more females. So you're better off carrying maybe one dominant male with 20 females, and then the population can rebound very quickly.
That's a very
these are
very
things
logical answer. Yeah.
And these are things that are very well known.
Yeah.
So yes, and depends on the type. Now, there's a whole set of characters we have that tell us about what type of species we were. Were we a species that lived very comfortably in areas where there was lots of food and it was steady, something like a gibbon, where he lives in tropical area where the fruiting trees are always producing? Or did we live in areas that were seasonal without the ability?
Yeah.
And we have lots of characters that suggest we had a harem mating system.
Yeah. Well, Esteban, I want to thank you for coming out to East Brunswick Television this afternoon.
Well,
and it's very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome.